Hi, this is Gladstone Payton, Director of Federal Affairs at Americans for the Arts. In anticipation of Arts Advocacy Day, we thought it'd be really helpful to point out a couple key legislative things that happen when we go up on a hill and we are deciding whether or not our advocacy is effective. There are a couple things in the legislative process you need to know that are just bare essentials for being an effective advocate. This, of course, is the legislative process. Now, there are things that you've probably seen before, like there's a bill on Capitol Hill from Schoolhouse Rock. Well, that's not far from the truth. Quite frankly, the way a bill moves through Congress and everything that surrounds it is as complicated as it seems. There are points in the legislative process by which you wonder whether or not the bill or anything that you care about that's moving through Congress ever will achieve that goal. To that end, I just want to tell you about three different things and different ways that the bills move through Congress. There are basically three different kinds of bills, and what we are looking for on Arts Advocacy Day mostly revolves around the National Endowment for the Arts and arts education and other bills and legislation that affect arts policy here in the United States at the federal level. The first one is really to start thinking about these three buckets in these terms. One is the appropriations bucket. Legislation that provides money from the Treasury to provide for programs and agencies under the federal jurisdiction. Now, technically, the House of Representatives is where all spending bills should start. They have the quote-unquote power of the purse. Now, that is just a constitutional requirement that is not necessarily obeyed all the time by both the U.S. House and Senate. The Senate can start working on bills if they want, and the House can start working on bills if they want, as long as they are reconciled down the road at some point. But given that, I just want to talk a little bit about the appropriations process. The appropriations process starts with basically a budget being passed by either in the House or the Senate that divides up the money amongst the 13 different appropriations committees. Each committee takes their little pile of money and decides on how they're going to spend it as they go forward. When we think about the National Endowment for the Arts and when we think about programs at the United States Department of Education and how they get money to spend on the programs which are under their jurisdiction, it all starts at this point. In the National Endowment for the Arts, the Interior Subcommittee gets their little pile of money and sees how much they can spend on the National Endowment for the Arts. Likewise, the Labor HHS bill in the House of Representatives takes their pile of money and sees how much they can put into the United States Department of Education. The difference between appropriations and my next bucket is one is about spending money, appropriating money, and for the purposes of funding things that we care about and come from a bill. The second bucket is authorization bills. Authorization is the process by which you actually create statutory bills that provide for making a program, making an agency, or passing a law through Congress that has a subset of other policy things that are executed by Congress and by the administration or the executive branch. Authorization bills are best spotlighted or highlighted by something. We'll go back to the National Endowment for the Arts. The National Endowment for the Arts was actually authorized or statutorily authorized in 1965 and in subsequent years is reauthorized. That is, their basic policy tenets have to be revisited every so often, and the actual process of making the law comes from authorization. That's your second bucket. So another example would be the Department of Education, the arts and education programs. We fund them through appropriations, but actually how they are distilled and disseminated and how the policy provisions of which they come from are executed all come from the authorization process. So the third bucket is bills for general purposes. This could be for anything from creating an agency, not unlike an authorization, but for very specific purposes. These resolutions cover the other various myriads of public laws that come out of Congress. So we think about it in three different ways. Appropriations, making money or providing for money for specific programs and for agencies. The second tier is authorization, those policy creating laws that put into effect the appropriations, and then other general resolutions which provide for different kinds of laws that don't necessarily fit neatly into those two other buckets. So, continue on, we will discuss how a bill actually becomes law through one of those three different processes. They kind of follow the same pattern. First, a member of Congress has to introduce a bill. Only members of Congress can write a bill and offer it for submission to the legislative council within the leadership structure of either house of Congress. After that, it is referred to a committee, and that committee may have a subcommittee that has specific jurisdiction to the specific topic or area that the bill covers. Now, you may be wondering, where's the President of the United States in all of this? Doesn't the President execute? Well, yes, he executes laws. He does not pass laws or offer legislative language. That is specifically the purpose of the United States Congress. So, when we move, let's take, for example, the Arts and Education program at the United States Department of Education. If you wanted to introduce a bill that either reauthorized that piece of legislation or made changes to it, you would write the bill, submit it to Legislative Council. Legislative Council would approve it or deny it, depending on what the parameters and constitutional restraints are of what you're asking for, and then refer it to the leadership of the House or the Senate. The House or the Senate leadership refers it to the Committee of Jurisdiction. In this case, arts and education programs, or education programs generally, go to the Education and Workforce Committee, which is split into different committees with underneath it, and that is referred again. Now, it could sit there for a long, long time. 90% of bills that are actually introduced in Congress within the 2-year terms of a session of Congress never make it to the light of day. The consideration is really not unlike what you do at your local board or within your own organization. You take an issue, you debate it, see if it's worthy of approval. The subcommittees take a look at the legislation and then refer it to the larger committee, or what we call the whole committee. When the whole committee does finally approve it, then it is ready for scheduling on the House floor, House or Senate floor. Now, that is another step in the process by which we don't know when the rest of it's going to happen. The House calendar, for example, gets things placed on it every day, many of which may never see the light of day. And that is because there are tons of priorities, and some of them may seem more pressing to certain communities or certain constituencies than others. At this point, it is really at the behest of the leadership within both houses of Congress to determine which are the priorities that they want to push for. The House calendar determines what goes to the House floor. And the House floor is where what we see on television or is portrayed in movies as the exciting point where we pass or defeat legislation. It can also be amended on the House floor. And so there are a lot of different considerations moving forward by which the legislation can change completely from its genesis in the committee and subcommittee level to when it's considered for House consideration. The House calendar, being what it is, only picks a few winners and a lot of losers. And so the next step in the process is the actual House floor consideration, where we meet in the House floor and they go into a procedural set called the Committee of the Whole, which is basically adopting the committee strategy on the House floor and open up the bill for amendment. Now, there's a couple other things that have to happen. A rule has to be given from the Rules Committee of either the House or the Senate that determines how the debate and how the structure of how the amendments to be considered are going to proceed. Once that is passed, then you proceed according to how the rule laid out the presentation of the bill. This can be a way of the House leadership or the congressional leadership of either chamber to determine how they want the bill to proceed. And that can either open up the bill for a lot of amendments and changes, or it can actually make the bill very much a predictable process by which there is only going to be an up or down vote on it. Then the bill goes to conference committee. That is a reconciliation between different versions of the bill, most likely between the Senate and the House versions of the same bill. In conference committee, you basically horse trade what is good and good for the different constituencies in both chambers. At that point, when they find an agreement in the conference committee, they produce a conference report or a conference bill, which will go back to both chambers to be approved in its entirety. Only then, when both of the conference report, which must have identical language or identical provisions within the piece of legislation, are approved, does it go to the president for signature. And that's how a bill becomes a law.